Welcome to the deep dive, where we crack open the source material so you can walk away well-informed but never overloaded. Today we're doing something a little different. It's a kind of institutional archaeology. We're looking at something most of us assume is solid, unchanging, the parliamentary tradition.
It's such a crucial topic because you see it all the time. The way things have always been done gets treated with this reverence, almost like it's constitutional law.
Exactly. But what happens when those procedures, those things we defend so fiercely, aren't actually core principles? What if they're just old habits?
And sometimes, even counterproductive habits.
That's the conflict right at the heart of the sources for this deep dive. We're using excerpts from The Evolution of Governance, Rethinking Parliamentary Tradition. And our mission really is to unpack why suggesting a simple change in a parliamentary system feels so radical.
Well, right, you're not just suggesting a practical reform. If you say, what about different working hours? Or let's change the layout of the chamber, it feels like you're committing some kind of heresy.
Institutional disobedience, that's a great way to put it.
So we need to cut through that feeling. We have to ask, what are we actually protecting? Is it the institution's core function, to scrutinize, to legislate?
Or are we just protecting a routine because it feels familiar, even if it's uncomfortable?
And that distinction is everything. It's the difference between real stewardship of democracy and just, institutional habit.
Okay, let's start there with this illusion of stasis, because it is incredibly powerful. The source argues we have to begin by just identifying the rituals that have sort of calcified, the things that don't really have much to do with good governance today.
And they're the things everyone complains about, but will also defend to the death.
So what are we talking about specifically?
We're talking about the culture of late nights. Really late nights, the intense pressure of compressed sittings,
Right.
And even the physical setup, the adversarial design that basically requires shouting across the floor.
And the source is clear on this, right? These aren't just quirky traditions. They actively get in the way of governing well.
Oh, absolutely. They have real operational consequences. Take the late nights. The source makes a great point here.
Which is?
Demanding that people handle complex legislative business at 1 in the morning doesn't make the work more serious. It just erodes scrutiny.
Because everyone's exhausted.
Exactly. You've got members who are physically exhausted, support staff stretched to their absolute limit, and they're supposed to be debating highly technical, complex amendments. Exhaustion isn't seriousness. It just leads to bad decisions.
And I imagine the compressed sitting calendar, that just makes it all worse.
It feeds right into it. In a lot of systems, members will spend these incredibly intense, packed weeks in the Capitol, and then they're away for weeks.
A feast or famine cycle.
That's the perfect phrase for it.
Yeah.
It forces rush debate when they're there, and it makes the detailed, serious work, the kind of stuff that happens in committees, so much harder to coordinate when they're not.
The source also touches on a social cost to all this, which I think is just as important.
It's a profound point.
When you build a culture around these grueling, unpredictable schedules, you're shrinking the pool of people who can even consider doing the job.
You're being structurally exclusionary. A system that basically penalizes anyone with a family or with caregiving duties or anyone who isn't already financially independent. Well, it's not just inefficient.
It guarantees that the people making the laws only come from a very narrow slice of society that can put up with that kind of life.
Right, a demographic that's comfortable with that traditional and frankly unsustainable pace.
And what's so fascinating is the emotional wall you hit when you try to change any of it. Why does talking about the calendar feel like questioning the foundations of the state?
I think it's because familiarity dresses itself up as principle. It has a habit of doing that.
What do you mean?
Well, if you spend 20 years of your life fighting through these late-night sessions, you have a psychological need to believe it was necessary, to rationalize that pain as part of the system's integrity.
So you defend it by talking about continuity, about how it's always been done.
Yes. And that language completely masks the real functional problems that we were just talking about.
So the source is basically saying, late nights on democracy, adversarial seating isn't accountability, exhaustion isn't seriousness.
They're just habits, things we've gotten used to. And the real problem is that when we accept this illusion of stasis, we completely misunderstand the institution's actual history.
Which is not static at all.
Not even close. Which brings us to the historical counter-argument. If you actually step back and look at the timeline, Parliament's history is one of constant adaptation. Sometimes forced, often painful, usually overdue.
So the idea that Parliament doesn't change isn't a defense of tradition.
It's a misunderstanding of its history.
Let's get into those facts, the big
Yeah.
evolutions. Because you're right, these weren't small tweaks. They were fundamental shifts in who held power.
Absolutely. Just think about who was even in the building. The sources remind us that for centuries, being in Parliament was for the landowning gentry. It was an unpaid job.
Which, of course, means if you weren't independently wealthy, you simply couldn't afford to do it. Representation was financially exclusive.
Precisely. And then the idea that MPs should be paid was introduced. The idea that their service should be compensated so that, a working man or woman could serve.
And that was controversial.
It was fought tooth and nail. Opponents were screaming that it would corrupt the entire system,
Yeah.
that it would turn honorable public service into just another job, a profession.
But looking back, paying MPs was one of the single most important democratic changes. It completely broadened who could stand for election.
It shattered the idea that wealth was a prerequisite for public service. And that's just one example.
What else?
Think about who was even allowed in the chamber physically. The fight to allow women to be elected as members, that was just over a century ago.
And it was fierce.
The idea that a woman could legislate for men was seen by opponents as a genuine existential threat to the constitutional order.
There's another one we just take for granted now, the fact that we can even hear the debates at all. Transparency.
Right. For a very long time, reporting on what was said in Parliament was a serious offense, a breach of privilege.
So the institution spent centuries legislating in private.
Essentially, yes. It wasn't until the 19th century that reporting the debates became accepted, let alone encouraged.
So there's the paradox. Everything we now think of as absolutely essential, paid MPs, universal suffrage, public scrutiny, was once resisted.
And resisted using the exact same language of preserving tradition that we hear today about, late sittings or committee structures.
That is a vital observation. The source really hammers this home. None of those changes were obvious at the time. They seemed radical, even dangerous.
Yet today they feel completely inevitable, integral to the whole identity of the institution.
Which really forces you, the listener, to ask, what changes are we resisting today that in 50 years will seem just as obvious and necessary?
Exactly. If our ancestors had frozen the system just because a certain calendar felt comfortable, the whole thing would have broken. Which leads us to maybe the most powerful symbol of this whole debate.
The chamber itself.
Yes, the physical space. When people talk about the chamber, they talk about the green benches, the dimensions, as if it's this ancient, sacred design.
A physical embodiment of timeless constitutional wisdom.
You feel the history in the room.
Yeah.
And you assume that the layout, that face-to-face adversarial setup, must be the product of centuries of deep political philosophy.
And here comes the reveal. The truth from the source material that just grounds this whole debate in reality.
The current chamber is a post-war rebuild.
That's it. That one fact. It just shatters the whole illusion of timelessness, doesn't it? Tell us about the rebuild. It wasn't some philosophical exercise.
Absolutely not. The House of Commons chamber was destroyed by bombing in 1941, so they had to rebuild it. But this is during a period of immense pressure, of severe post-war austerity. The country had other priorities.
Like rebuilding houses and infrastructure.
Of course, so they didn't sit down and ask, what is the perfect design for a 20th century democracy?
No, the priority was just getting it done. Continuity. Expediency.
They deliberately kept the old, small, narrow footprint. They kept the adversarial benches facing each other.
Why?
Because changing it to a semicircle, for instance, which might encourage more collaboration, would have been a massive, expensive project.
It would have meant redesigning the whole internal complex.
Right. It was just simpler, cheaper, and much, much faster to replicate the space that had been destroyed.
So the very layout that dictates so much of the tradition, the two sides shouting across a narrow aisle, is actually the result of wartime expediency, not ancient wisdom.
It's the perfect illustration of the entire argument. We're protecting the way the institution happened to work at one specific, chaotic moment in time.
Not a design based on optimal function.
This fact completely reframes the debate. When you talk about changing the seating or using electronic voting, you're not desecrating a sacred text.
It proves the building is a product of circumstance, not scripture.
Exactly. And once you realize you're protecting a decision made out of wartime necessity, not ancient tradition, the whole argument it shifts.
That's the real difference, isn't it? Stewardship is commissioning a review of the calendar to attract new talent. Habit is blocking that review because the pain of the current system feels familiar.
Right. And if you connect that back to the bigger picture, it means that most objections to sensible reform today, modernizing work hours using
Yep.
better technology, they aren't really about constitutional principle. They're about inertia. They're about discomfort.
And that discomfort seems to be the highest hurdle. Why does hearing the word change feel like hearing tear it all down? The source argues this fear is totally out of proportion.
It is. No one serious is talking about scrapping Parliament. They're talking about adjusting it so that the old way of doing things actually aligns with the incredibly complex job that needs doing now.
Parliament has only ever survived by adjusting.
Always. Usually after a period where the old habits finally stop serving the mission.
And that gets us to the big prerequisite for any real reform. If we know Parliament can change, because it always has, the question isn't if it can.
But which changes will actually strengthen it? And which ones are we avoiding just because they make us feel uncomfortable?
And to get past that discomfort, you have to start with a more fundamental question.
You have to be crystal clear about one thing. What is Parliament actually for in the 21st century?
Before you argue about the late nights or the seating plan,
You need a consensus on its purpose. Is its main job public debate? Is it detailed scrutiny of legislation? Is it representation? All of the above.
that clarity has to come before the fight over procedure. If you don't agree on the destination, you can't have a rational argument about the map.
And once you agree on the function, then the procedure is just a tool. And if the tools you're using, the late nights, the adversarial shouting, if they actively get in the way of that primary function,
Then tradition actually demands that you change them.
precisely.
That really is the key takeaway for today. Parliamentary tradition is adaptation. History shows us that change is the only constant. So to argue against procedural change isn't defending history, it's misunderstanding it.
And that leaves a final important question for you to think about as we wrap up. How much of the frustration that we all feel with parliamentary governance today, how much of that comes from expecting the institution to be something it never was? And how much comes from its own failure to adapt to now? Define its purpose first, and then you can judge its effectiveness.
We hope this deep dive gave you a new perspective on the habits and the history that shape our governance. We look forward to seeing what sources you send our way next time.